All right, welcome back. Ready for, as promised, a tour of the Shroud exhibit? Well, as you can see, we're not in the Shroud exhibit, but I promise, last night with some young students, and we actually had a tour of about 2 hours long. And when I came home and popped in my photo card into the computer, it said, "Format, please." And so that didn't go exactly as planned, I admit. But do you ever see God's hand in these kinds of things? I think I did. And to be honest, as I was reflecting on that tour, it occurred to me that is actually perhaps not the best for you, and I'll explain why. Because as I found myself explaining the tour, I realized that I wasn't able to give the same depth to certain areas that I'll be able to share with you in the courses to come. And so what I propose is that I actually do the same thing right here with the help of the PowerPoint slides that I've prepared now. And I introduce you to some of the great themes, the big questions that you can carry with you throughout the semester and to continue to deepen in and to find your own answers to these very same questions. So I'm purposely going to leave some loose ends, and I hope that's enjoyable for you, and I think it's more helpful in the end. So let's try this. I think it will also give me the chance not to, say, steal my thunder, right? Because there are things that in the Shroud tour I have to deliver very quickly because time is of the essence. But here, I don't want to race through if I have the chance to then come back to these themes and develop them in a whole class period, say, that's dedicated to the crown of thorns, for example. And so I think that will be a better introduction. Without further ado, let's dive in, shall we? Okay, so I like to begin with why Christians are interested in the Shroud. And there's a passage that we read in the Catholic Church on Easter Sunday. And that, of course, is this famous passage where the beloved disciple and Peter go racing to the tomb. Why? Because Mary Magdalene tells the great news that the tomb is empty. Someone's taken the body. They don't know, she doesn't know where anyone has laid him. And so off they go. And this is so fascinating to me that even though there are so many details that we would love to have about the Shroud, or better, that we would love to have about Christ's passion, and yet we don't, right? The gospel writers are painfully discreet. And yet when it comes to this moment of discovering some dirty rags lying on the ground, you're going to find that in 3 verses, St. John the Evangelist will write 3 times the word Othonia, right? That's the Greek word that John uses to write about the linen wrappings or the burial cloths or the linen cloths, right? In different translations, you'll find different words. But this is what many people have looked to see, this must be indicating the Shroud, today what we would call the Shroud of Turin. Is it? I'm going to leave that as an open question at the start. But you can well imagine that if this is what Peter and John saw that morning, and when they saw it, don't forget the conclusion, right? He saw and believed. Well, the question is, what did he see so that he believed? And so we'll have to look to the Shroud to see, is it a silent witness? Is it testifying to something that it and it alone saw, the very resurrection of Jesus? And when they discover this witness, is that why they saw and believed? Again, I'm not proposing any answers to the questions. I'm just asking them. And I want you to really consider this throughout the year. What do you think they saw? And what would have explained John's belief? What did he see so that he believed? That's a big question. So I think it's clear why Christians are interested in the Shroud. Because if it indeed is the face of our Savior that is recorded there on that cloth, if it is the blood that was shed for our salvation, obviously from a Christian perspective, that's going to tug on our heartstrings. But the question is, what possible meaning could a cloth like this have if it's not? If it's just an object that has no connection with Jesus Christ? These, again, open questions, okay? Keep them with you. All right, so that's a little bit of the perspective of the pilgrim. Let's look with the eyes, though, of a scientist, right? Because what most people have heard about the Shroud is that it's a fake, right? That it was carbon dated in 1988, and it dates from 1260 or 1390. It was probably fabricated in France, and, you know, it's been used to support this false notion that Jesus died and rose from the dead or something, right? And so you probably saw headlines like this one, Turin Shroud, shown to be a fake. That made front page news right after the publication of these results. Here you have Dr. Michael Tite, and this is the day that it was revealed that the Shroud is actually from medieval times. Well, we're going to have a lot of time to consider this question, but I just want to open the discourse as, notice this, it's a scientific study now. It's atheists, it's agnostics that are interested also in looking at this document and why. Haven't we just put it to rest that it's a medieval fake? Hardly, hardly. And I want to show why this is one of the great mysteries of all time, the Shroud of Turin, one of the great controversies of all time. And you know where I would begin to show that? With the story of this man. Secondo Pia is an amateur photographer who's invited to a wedding of the royal family. Did you know that the Shroud was in the possession of the Savoy family? It wasn't until 1983 that it was bequeathed to Pope John Paul II and became his personal property, right? But at this moment in time, right, to add a little pomp and circumstance to the wedding, yeah, bring out the burial shroud of Jesus, that should do the trick, right? And so Secondo Pia has the great privilege of photographing this linen for the first time in history. And here's a picture of his camera and what that looked like back then. And you can imagine his surprise. I would love to step into his shoes and to have relived this magical moment when he steps into the dark room, right, to develop the film of his picture taken of the Shroud. Can you imagine that this is what mankind had been looking at apparently for some 19 centuries, right? The first photo cameras are invented in 1840. Secondo Pia snaps his photo in 1898. And even though he looks at this, you know, subtle face on the linen, look what he discovers when he goes into the dark room and sees for the first time this negative image. I mean, he must have wanted to drop the plate in his own hands and say, "Oh my God." Literally, right there he was. And so this picture it shows just the subtle detail even around the eyes, shadows around the lips and mustache, and it's just so anatomically perfect. A little too perfect, some would say. "Come on, Secondo Pia," they said, "where did you really get this photo? This is a little too good to be true." Do you know, it wasn't until 1931 that Giuseppe Enrie, now a professional photographer working on orthochromatic film, will repeat the experiment, photographing the whole length of the Shroud to find it too acts as a photo document. That is, the negative image is no negative at all. The negative image is the positive image. Yeah, so let's juxtapose these two images and notice something. First of all, it's obvious that what was white is now black, what was dark is now bright, right, in the photo negative. But notice also that you're looking at the mirror image. And that's helpful information for the rest of the semester. It actually took me a while to figure this out, so I'll share it with you from the beginning. But when you're looking at the photo negative, that predominantly dark image, notice the top of the head. You can see that the blood flow is actually in the shape of a 3, right? But if you look at the other image, you'll notice that that blood flow is in the shape of an epsilon. Or perhaps more obvious at this distance, look at which hand is on top. Is it the left or the right? If you look at the photo negative, it looks like the left hand is on top. But isn't it the opposite on the original? And that's because the shroud itself is a mirror image. That is, the linen lies on top of the body. So the image that's impressed on the linen is not what the man looked like, let's say, in real life, but only the mirror image. So when you look in the mirror and you raise your right hand, the man in the mirror raises his left. Anyway, that'll be helpful information later on. But above all, think about what this means. This is what's so mind-boggling, right? Because if the shroud is itself a negative image, such that the negative of the negative brings us back at the positive, I know it sounds confusing, but it is confusing, right? Because a linen cloth shouldn't be a photonegative. What is the shroud the result of photography? 1840 years before the invention of photography, right? How does that make sense? And of course, we have no other linens, no other burial cloths that bear the image of a man, much less as a photonegative, a photo document. So this is, of course, the beginning of a great mystery. What formed this image that bears these enigmatic characteristics? And above all, and this is the question I always like to ask, why, right? What does it mean that it's a photo document, that it's a photonegative? Is there some divine spiritual message here? I don't know. Maybe. This is something, though, I think it's at least worth asking. You know what I think of? This is a very personal reflection I share with you now, especially since we're in that passage of the pastoral and biblical consideration of the shroud. Allow me to share this moment, right, where Pope Benedict XVI, I believe it was in May of 2010, when he visited Turin to see the shroud. And he said something mind-boggling. Really, stays with me even to this day, because he said, you know, Pope Benedict is speaking, he says, I've reflected on the fact that this acts as a photo document that contains both a positive and negative image. And in real life, that's how it really was, right? The darkest mystery became the source of the most luminous hope that's never ending. And isn't that a beautiful reflection that this is Good Friday? But what was good about that Friday when we put God to death? Homicide is bad. Deicide is much worse. And yet it is a Good Friday because God has brought good out of the darkness, right? Out of the darkness, a light has shone. Or in the words of St. Paul, where sin abounded, grace abounded all the more. And so I think it's appropriate that this image is a photonegative. But that's just my spiritual reflection. You can take it or leave it. All right, let's move forward, because I want to show you that it's not just in 1898 that scientists were playing with technology, but also in 1976, when in the basement, after work hours, 2 American scientists from the United States Air Force Academy were playing with a VP8 image analyzer. And when they slip a photo of the shroud under the VP8, guess what they found out? They found out that this image, this 2-dimensional image, encodes 3-dimensional information. And the VP8 can crack that code. In other words, we can discern 3D information with the help of modern technology. To make this more plastic for you, we can make a statue, right, based on the information that is contained in that cloth. But we weren't able to see that information many, many years ago. Only today can we visualize it with the help of modern tools. And so this is a watershed moment, right? Because it's going to bring together some of the most elite scientists from across America, some of the highest powered laboratories. And here we're talking about Catholics and Protestants and Jews and agnostics and atheists. These men and women are coming together not because of any creed that they have in common, but just because they have a common question. What is that question? The question is, what formed that image? By what mechanism what did it come about? You know, is it the fruit of a painting? Is it a scorch? Is it a rubbing? Is it a medieval photograph? Right? These are some of the theories that they toss around. Well, they said, let's do a test. They petitioned the royal family himself, the Savoy family. They get permission for 5 days, 120 hours, to do a whole battery of exams, and they get it. And so they prepare for a year back home. They bring 80 crates of state-of-the-art equipment overseas, and then they test the shroud. And we're talking every area of science: physics, biology, chemistry, ultraviolet, X-ray, infrared, microscopy, paralysis mass spectroscopy, forensic medicine, blood samples, sticky tape samples to study the pollen. The list goes on and on. And so the shroud has been studied, we're talking hundreds of thousands of hours before, during, and after STURP, right? The Shroud of Turin research project that took place in 1978. After a year of preparation, soon after, the three-dimensional qualities were perceived for the first time, visualized for the first time with the help of the VP8. So, notice what we've come to see. That from a Christian perspective, the shroud was interesting as an act of devotion, right? You would venerate the shroud. Pilgrims would flock to Turin to contemplate the Passion, right? And now science is interested in this great puzzle. What brought about an image that acts not only as a photonegative, but contains three-dimensional information? And so this is what brings the scientists to Italy to study the shroud. Now, let's look at the shroud for some basics. All right, just the ABCs, let's say, of the shroud. First thing I want to say is a little bit about the dimensions. It might seem superficial, but there is a point here. So for those who use feet, it's 14 feet wide and 3 inches, and then tall, 3'7". Okay, this is a massive cloth. Okay, in meters, that would be 4.4 meters wide, 1.1 meters tall. Now, you don't buy lumber when you go to Home Depot, say, in units like, give me a 1.1, right? Or give me a 4.4 by 1.1. But you might say, give me a 2 by 8. So in Syrian cubits, an ancient unit of measure in the area of Palestine, in Jesus' time, it's quite likely that one would ask for such a size, a 2 by 8. And so before we get into the minutiae, notice a glaring contradiction. We have this big cloth, 14 feet wide, and yet it must have cost so much money because of the weave that we see there. And I'll show you in just a moment what I mean. But look at the image that's on this cloth. A man that's been crucified, a crown of thorns we shall soon see, scourged head to toe, and pierced in the side. Well, at the very least, we can say that this man was tortured in death, treated as a social pariah, an outcast, but in his burial, treated as a king. All right, so he's taken down from the cloth and he's wrapped in this way. You can see in this image how the cloth would have covered the front and the back, so that when you open up, the inside of the cloth is colored in such a way that we see the frontal image on the left, and then to the right, the dorsal image. Okay, so here in this picture, imagine that I've cut the cloth in half and now repositioned so the man is standing tall, just so you can look on the body. But I just want to explain how the cloth is covering the body. But look more closely at this cloth, and you'll see that the weave is a herringbone weave. Literally, that means, right, a fish is a herringbone. And it looks kind of like the spinal cord of a fish. If you notice that there are kind of diagonal patterns on the weave. It's achieved by going over 3 and under 1. Take the thread and go over 3 and then under 1. And you get these kind of diagonal lines. Why even mention this? Because it means that this cloth is very pricey. That's not superficial detail. That's actually important for asking the question, who could have acquired such a thing? 14 feet long, comparable to a priest's liturgical garment. Who has the means to make such a purchase? And why would they do it for a man who's a criminal? Well, the reason I ask that question is that it's the gospel, right, that makes good sense of that seeming contradiction. It's the gospel that tells us that it's Joseph of Arimathea who provides his own rock-hewn tomb. Joseph of Arimathea is a member of the Sanhedrin, a man with high social standing. We remember that it's Nicodemus, also a member of the Sanhedrin, who will purchase 100 Roman pounds of aloe. How much does that cost, right? Does Jesus have friends in high places? Oh yeah. And they're this happen to be the ones that are providing for his burial. Now, does Jesus have friends in power, or excuse me, are there men in power who are at odds with what Jesus is doing? Who want to eliminate Jesus? Most certainly, the gospel tells of that too. And so I think the gospels actually make good sense of the data. But if we were to throw away the Bible, let's say, and just have a purely scientific consideration, what would we do with this data? What would we do with the fact that there's this seeming contradiction? I don't think the microscope really helps in that case. So what I propose as we move forward, and really for the rest of the semester, not just in the time together today, is to look with 2 eyes, right? In a first moment, for sure, look with your microscope. Look with the eyes of empirical science. But then, in a second moment, look to the scripture and ask, what does it reveal? Are these 2 visions compatible? What I think we have before our eyes is a wonderful case study. We can see if faith and reason are really 2 wings by which the human spirit ascends to the contemplation of the truth, right? That was the words of John Paul II in his encyclical Fides et Ratio. Let's have a look as we move forward. All right, there's the weave, the herringbone weave. Now, for the most perhaps interesting part, for some of you anyway, I imagine, right? What does the shroud tell us about the physical sufferings of the man? I won't go as deeply as we could here, just because I want to introduce you to these themes and then leave it to the experts in forensic medicine, for example, to go deeper. But a few things I want to point out right from the beginning, just to orient your study. And I know you'll be reading Doctor at Calvary very soon by Pierre Barbet, the French surgeon that I recommended in yesterday's lesson. So let's have a look, shall we? Just a little caveat. Some of the things that we're going to say are intense, okay? And so I wanted to prep you for that. But it's not because I have some fixation for pain or, that I really just like blood and guts or something. No, this is graphic for sure. And I think maybe we need a little warning, but there's a reason for it. The reason is this, that this is love in its most radical form. Those were the words of Pope Benedict, right? It's a similar idea that we find in Pope John Paul II, when he said, what was it, in the threshold, crossing the threshold of hope, he says, there is no Christian holiness without devotion to the Passion, just as there is no holiness without the centrality of the Paschal mystery. And so it seems that we need the cross and the resurrection in our spiritual lives if we're going to be holy. And I think that's an important starting point as we move forward into the Passion. So where does it all begin? Where did Christ begin to suffer according to the Gospels? Well, I wanted to look first to the agony and the arrest. This will be our first class, by the way, next week. So I'll save some of this for next week. But what are some of those details that we read? It's really interesting what Luke has to say. That Jesus was in such agony, he prayed so fervently that his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. Right? Now, it just so happens that it's Luke, and only Luke, who gives us this information. And apparently, according to Paul, Luke is a physician. Could it be that he's really describing a biological phenomenon here? Because you can read in the peer-reviewed journals about such a phenomenon called hematidrosis. Now, I'm no expert. I'm not going to go deep, but you yourself can examine such a thing. I remember speaking in China one time, and we were having to prep for the translation. And we looked up this word, hematidrosis, and found out that it was 3 Chinese characters. Blood, sweat, sickness. So basically what it means is that under your subcutaneous capillaries, right, those thinnest of all blood vessels, right where the arteries connect with the veins, they become distended and burst. Not because somebody's beating up on you, but just because the fear of death is so imminent, right? Some extraordinary circumstance is causing the victim, basically their blood vessels to explode, right? There's a hemorrhaged blood, there's a hemorrhage under the surface of the skin, not necessarily breaking through the surface of the skin, but this blood now exits out of the sweat pores, and little red dots appear on the surface of even young children when they see a syringe, or grown men when they were in a shipwreck or something like that. This intense feeling provokes this physiological response. Now, I've read some journals that speak of the effect that the biggest organ in your body, the skin, is left sensitive to touch. Now, was this the case for Jesus? I can't be sure, I suppose. But if it's true, what Luke records, and if he means to describe hematidrosis, one of the possible effects is that the skin is so sensitive that just to blow air over the surface of the skin might have caused pain. And I think that's worth considering, right? Because this is the moment that the Passion begins. What's the first violence that man does to Jesus after this moment of prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane? You'll remember that the arrest comes about not because the enemies know exactly who they're looking for. They get help from who? From Judas, right? And what is the sign that Judas will show so that these men know who to arrest? I think it's important. I think it's worth considering that the sign is a kiss. And that kiss, which ought to have been a sign of friendship, is instead becomes a sign of betrayal. And so it hurts all the more when he comes up to Jesus with a big smile and says, Chaire, right? Hail, Rabbi, right? That word literally means rejoice. But what Judas was saying with his gesture was, I hope you die. And so I think it's appropriate that it registered in Christ's body, perhaps, as physical pain. What a kiss it was. All right, let's move forward, because if you were to look now with the eyes of a scientist, can you see signs of hematidrosis? No. No, we can't see sweat and little drops of blood or something. But remember that the body is placed in the tomb after the deposition from the cross, right? And so this is Friday night that the body is now touching the cloth for the first time, not Thursday night when Jesus was in his agony. So what do you see in this face? Well, according to the American scientists, we have a broken nose. If you come to 2/3 down the nose, you might see a dark line across that shows an excoriation that then moves to the right cheek. We have a triangular kind of excoriation that moves off to the other cheek. And there's a swollen right cheek. And this inflammation is important. It seems to be the case that the victim was struck not just right before he was laid in the tomb, but swelling 24 hours before. Like, if you punch me now, I won't swell right away. But if you come back 24 hours later, you can expect my cheek to be swollen. And so this too seems to coincide with the gospel data, right? That Jesus was struck after he was arrested and brought to the Sanhedrin, and then he was brought in front of Caiaphas, and the soldiers strike him. And we'll dive into that more deeply later on, but I wanted to point this out, that we have excoriations on the face, we have a broken bone. By the way, I say broken nose, I don't mean to say a broken nasal bone. The septum is separated. That is, the cartilage at the tip of the nose is what's separated from the nasal bone up above, and that's what we mean when we say a broken nose, right? So don't think I was contradicting the scripture that says, "Not a bone shall be broken," right? There's no need to affirm such a thing. Okay, so this is a little bit about that moment of arrest and the first violence that is done to Jesus. We'll come back to this to ask the bigger question. What's the bigger question? Not what did he suffer, but why? What does it mean? I want to come back to that next time. But let's move forward, because after the arrest and the trial by night with the Sanhedrin, Jesus is brought eventually to Pontius Pilate, and he has him scourged. Okay, we're going to dedicate a class to this moment as well, but what do we know about the scourging? Well, it's probably not like what Mel Gibson portrayed in his movie, The Passion of the Christ. In fact, when he was interviewed, he told us, "I want to drive you over the edge. I want to exaggerate to provoke a response," right? So there's no way you could survive if you had, jagged metal tearing up the skin, leaving that much blood spilled. You just die then and there. But what we find on the shroud is actually quite credible, historically speaking, archaeologically speaking, and we're going to go into this more deeply with Adagrossi, for example, later on in the semester. But let me point out that many people have supposed that what the instrument of torture that was used on the victim, the man of the shroud, was the flagrum taxilatum, right? There were different types of flagra, right? Different types of whips or scourge instruments. There was probably a stick or handle that had leather straps. If there were 3 leather straps, we can imagine 120 lashes, because we have 360 or thereabout marks, signs of these lead balls that you see in the picture here. And so that means that every one of those marks is comparable to a 3rd-degree burn, right? As far as the damage that it does to the body. This is some serious pain that we're talking about. There were other types of whips that had bone at the end. And bone is jagged, so it might have perforated the skin. But it doesn't weigh as much as lead. Lead is a much more severe instrument. So what I would simply draw your attention to is to look at the credibility of the witness that we see on the shroud. That the instrument that we find, wherever there were Roman soldiers, we also find this very same marks on the shroud. And look, it's all over the body. So a certain Giulio Ricci would spend time looking at these marks, and he would count them, and he would even try to discern the provenance, that is, where is this man standing, the one who's doing the scourging? On the left of the body or in the right of the body? Others will go more deeply into this, but look immediately just to see that a lot of those wounds that land in the mid-body air region land perpendicular to the main axis of the body. That is, it's a 90-degree angle. And yet those those marks that are inflicted near the chest or near the feet, that is, towards the extremities of the body, they land not at a perpendicular angle, but at an oblique angle. And so it's likely that one man is standing in one spot, but he's pivoting as he strikes towards the head and then towards the feet. And so it's just, I think, necessary that we ask, is it likely that a con artist was able to paint or portray in some mysterious way these details that were discerned in modern times? And if he's painting in the Middle Ages, was he such a genius and with such foresight that he was able to portray these marks in such a way that only generations later, centuries later, men of science would discover? I find that unlikely, right? And so really each one needs to weigh the cumulative force of so many of these elements when discerning the authenticity question. Does this shroud really belong to the historical person of Jesus of Nazareth? I don't think there's one element that would give us the definitive answer. It's when we pool together all of the evidence that we find what I think is a convincing case. But that, I admit, is my humble opinion. Others can disagree with me. Let's move forward, though. I want you to see that, especially as we look to the photo negative, and I've turned up the contrast, obviously, here so that you can see those marks. You're going to see these scourge marks from the heel all the way to the neck, the front and the back, right? And the victim is scourged everywhere, even in the pelvic region. He's naked when he was scourged. How do we know that there was no loincloth? Well, the wounds in that area of the body are just as severe as everywhere else. So if you were wearing a loincloth, we would expect something less pronounced. That's not the case. The victim was naked. And so that was the purpose, right? To humiliate you. But that was man's purpose. Again, I want to ask the deeper question. What's God's purpose, right? Jesus would say in the scriptures, "No one takes my life from me. I lay it down of my own accord. I have the power to lay it down, and I have the power to take it up again. This is the charge I have received from my Father." So according to Jesus' own words, his sufferings aren't superficial. They're not coincidental. He could have saved us, I suppose, with a paper cut. Why these sufferings? Why scourging? Why nakedness? Why this shame? And I want to go deeper into that this semester, but I'll leave it for your own prayer and consideration now. What would you say? I don't have the definitive answer. I have perhaps my own guess. But what do you think is the meaning of these sufferings? I think that's a question we should carry with us. The crowning with thorns. Oh, this is probably my favorite element. I think this is such a deep mystery, and there's so much we learn when we contemplate the crown of thorns. We're going to dedicate a whole class to just this. What can I tell you from the start? Just a little teaser. Well, what I think is surprising is that the crown is not what any of us expected. When you look to the shroud, what is actually recorded is not a circlet, not a band that covers just around the ears but leaves the top of the head exposed. Instead, on the shroud, we have a cap of thorns, something like a helmet that covers the entire surface of the head. We have a reconstruction here that's also in our exhibit, right? One of the species of plants that might have been used is the Ziziphus spina Christi, right? That the Latin genus and species name, the very name Spina Christi means thorns of Christ. Now these thorns are 3/4 of an inch long, and they might be supple when the plant is green, but when it dries, these thorns are hard as nails. Some forensic doctors say that those thorns press through the skin all the way to the bony plate. I can imagine what a suffering this would have been. But on the shroud, what do we see? What is this evidence that points to this cap of thorns? Well, look here at these two images. Obviously, you have the shroud in the original and then the photo negative. At the nape of the neck, right, you'll see a blood stain kind of at the center or just below the center. And can you kind of see how there is a concave curve, right? We see that from the ears, the blood is flowing towards the center and down. And it seems that there might be some sort of wicker plant that is binding together this mess of thorn that's up top. And we have over 30 flows of blood, indicating many puncture wounds, something like thorns, for example, right, would have caused such a thing. So here's a bigger image where you can see that blood stain. But this is a surprise. No one was expecting it. So if we turn back to this con artist theory, right, if a man was trying to foist on us a false narrative, right, if he was trying to say this shroud records the story of Jesus who is crowned with thorns, my question is, why did he paint it in such an unexpected way? No one was expecting a crown that looked like this. What holy card shows Jesus with a cap of thorns? What statue? What crucifix? And so it deviates from the norm. Why would a con artist do such a thing? I think the shroud just may be portraying the raw fact. But again, I leave it to your discernment. Let's move forward. I'll leave it for later to discern the bigger question, right? What does the crown mean? Right? That's always the more important question. What's the relevance? What's the message of this crown? If Jesus himself said that no suffering was meaningless. Okay, so what I think is fascinating that the scientists notice is that we can differentiate arterial blood, that is blood that flows out of an artery, from venous blood. So this blood stain, for example, right at the center that looks like an epsilon, that is from the frontal vein. Not an artery, but a vein. Did we know this in the Middle Ages? Could we differentiate the musculature around the artery and differentiate it from a vein? I doubt it. But this is what the shroud records. Okay, so evidence of the crown. I'll say this from the start. One of the most important reasons the crown is important is because we don't know any other man who is both crucified and crowned. Jesus is the only candidate. If you look in history, if you look in the Bible, outside of the Bible, we don't know of any other crucified man who wore a crown of thorns. Just Jesus. And as we'll continue to see, it's not just those two sufferings, crucifixion and crown, that combine or converge on Christ, but we're going to also see as we move forward scourging, crowning, crucifixion, and a lance in the side. That's 4 different major pathologies that coincide with the biblical figure Jesus of Nazareth. Now, what do we find after the crowning with thorns? We find that Jesus carries the cross. Is there evidence on the shroud that this man carried such a weight across his shoulders? Have a look, and what you'll see is not what you found in Mel Gibson's The Passion, right? It's not likely at all that Jesus carried a big, large T cross, right? With the vertical and horizontal beams. That would have weighed over 300 pounds, right? Most likely. But we do read about in the literature from the first century that the victim was made to carry his patibulum, right? That is the horizontal beam. And perhaps he carried it in this way. Look closely now to the shroud image. And of course, we'll look again at the positive and negative. And what we're going to see is 2 excoriations, right? Aggravation of the skin, like the weight of the wood is pressing and rubbing against the back. And so one of them is here, right here at the top of the right shoulder, okay? and it's kind of like in this square shape. But come down, and then towards the spine, you'll see on the other side another excoriation that seems to indicate this diagonal line. It seems that the victim is favoring the right shoulder, and perhaps when he falls or when he loses his balance or wavers, one end of this long beam crashes against the shoulder blade on the opposite side. And so, if I've understood correctly, the shoulder blade sticks out a little bit, and so it's likely that a beam of wood would leave excoriations in just this manner. Again, I should leave it for the forensic doctors to go deeper into these themes, but I do think it's important from the start to have your bearings a little bit, okay? So that's why I do this. Some have suggested that since we read in the scriptures that Jesus was crucified in the middle with a man on the right and on the left, it's likely that he was tied to a chain gang. And so he didn't have his hands free, perhaps, to brace himself for a fall. And so when he became weak, he fell perhaps to his knees at first, and then perhaps all the way to his face. And I say that because on the shroud, what we find is that there's soil, not just on the feet, but also on the right knee. And not only there, but also on the tip of the nose. And that soil, by the way, we can study its chemical composition. We can look under a microscope and discern that this is calcium carbonate with traces of strontium. And even we can identify its crystalline structure to be travertine aragonite, which one geologist will say it's rare. It matches, though, the grottos of Jerusalem like a fingerprint. And so again, to return to the hypothesis that this was fabricated in France, what then is it doing with this Palestinian soil? Not just anywhere, mind you, but precisely in those places where you would expect contact with the ground, the feet, the right knee, and the tip of the nose. But that's bad news, right, for Jesus, if this is the case, right? Because that means 75 pounds, or even as much as 125 pounds, came crashing down on the crown of thorns when he fell to his face. I suppose my question would be, why did he get up from the ground? I can't imagine what motivation he would have had. But that's perhaps for your own contemplation. Let's move on to the crucifixion. I want to ask what we know from the eyes of a scientist. What do we see when we look to the shroud that indicates crucifixion? Well, what you're going to see is that there's an exit wound of a nail. Okay, so the nail was obviously driven into the wrist, it would seem, from the shroud, and then exits out the other side of the wrist. And notice where the nail is placed. That will be an interesting consideration. I don't know about you, but many of the crucifixes that I've seen, many of the paintings that I've seen Jesus portrayed, show the nails here in the center of the palms. Once again, the shroud surprises us. But what it shows us is actually more credible from a scientific point of view. If you want to ask, which is more likely? Which would have held the weight of the body? Well, we know that a nail here in the center, even after 10 minutes, would not have sustained even half the weight of the human body. Pierre Barbet will write about this in his book. But it's just that there's no transversal support here. This is all soft tissue. But here in the wrist, we have a big bundle of bones. Of course, you have your phalanges, your carpals, your metacarpals are here. He discerns an anatomical path that if you drive a nail right in the center here of the wrist, these bones open up and allow for the passage of the nail, and then they reconfigure in such a way that the man is securely fastened to the cross. However, there's bad news, because there are two nerves that pass right through this region, the median nerve and the ulnar nerve. And they're not just motor digits, they're motor nerves that would control the movement in the digits, right? They're also sense nerves that will send shock waves of pain through the central nervous system, and this for 3 6 hours perhaps. Perhaps it was somewhere like 4.5 hours that Jesus was hanging on the cross. We can return to that question later. But can you imagine what it must have been to suffer such a thing? So it's likely that the stipes, that is the vertical piece of the cross, was already planted in the ground. The victim arrives to the scene of execution and he stretches his arms out wide. There's probably a pre-established hole in the cross, and then the Roman soldier would drive in the nail, and then the victim would be in this position. And then he's placed in a vertical position in such a way that there's a moment where all of the weight of the wood hangs on these 2 nails in the hands. And if he's wearing the crown of thorns, he can't even move forward to use his back to sustain the wood. Instead, all of the weight is on his hands until they hoist him up and plop him down on the vertical piece. And now, as you can see here, there's probably a fixture at the top of the cross, if I've understood rightly. Again, I'm inviting you, not just begging your indulgence here, but I really want you to reconsider these in light of the other experts that will speak to these questions, right, later on in the course. But it seems that Jesus, or I should say, the man of the shroud, right, is in a 90-degree position, but then once placed on the cross, now sags some 25 degrees as he's in the vertical position. And the reason we would say this is that there's a blood stain at the wrist which shows a bifurcation pattern, right? There's a 5 to 7 degree difference between one flow of blood and then another. And so what's happening here is gravity changing? No, right? The blood is flowing down, but the victim is changing the position of his wrist. He's pivoting around this 9-inch nail, perhaps, with a square cross-section. And so this is what would explain this bifurcation pattern. Again, we'll come back to this. But this, for me, is one of those powerful signs that points to authenticity. Because did a medieval con artist understand this kind of pattern? And then he reproduced it in such a way that even today, modern scientists and forensic doctors can say, yeah, this makes sense. He's changing from an upright position to a relaxed position in order to breathe. Okay, so I'll just explain how this works. Once you see that the nail is here in the feet, according to the shroud, it looks like one foot is over the other. So I guess we have the left foot over the right. So on the shroud, you see that only the base of the right foot is fully visible, and the toes of the left foot are invisible because they seem to be placed on top of the right foot. I hope that makes sense with the help of these pictures. But it means that that is where the victim will have to press down on the nail in his feet in order to rise up and therefore exhale, as this diagram will show. So it seems from this double flow that's coming from the wrist that there are 2 positions while on the cross. Obviously, one would want to relax, that is, sag to a lower position. But then what happens if now these muscles between the ribs, or these intercostal muscles, are fixed in a position of inhalation, right? When you breathe in, you rise up, but when you breathe out, you relax. But you can't do that if your hands are not able to be low, but they're forced high. The only thing that you can do to compensate is press down in the nail in your feet, rise up in the nail on the nails in your hands, and that would explain this movement that would account for this blood stain. Okay, so that will orient you for your further studies. But again, I will invite you to the biblical consideration. What did it mean for Jesus to spend those long hours on the cross? What was it for him to speak? What was it for him to pray? Things like, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. my God, why have you forsaken me?" And Jesus is doing a lot of talking from the cross, despite the difficulty to draw breath. And I think that should enter into our contemplation. Okay, so that's, I leave for your own reflection. But we also find that there's evidence for the death of Jesus. And that's important to say, right? For those who would say, perhaps Jesus just swooned and then he was nursed back to health. It doesn't seem that that's the case according to this cloth. What we see on the shroud is that the wound is here, just between the 5th and 6th rib. We have a wound that is 4 centimeters wide, and it would correspond to the shape of a Roman lance. And there's just a distance of about 3.5 inches or 10 centimeters to the heart. If there's not a traumatic surgeon standing by with a wound like this, it's a fatal blow every time. And so look at this statue that's actually here in Rome in the Capitoline Museum, right? It's called the Dying Gaul. What I think is interesting about this famous statue is that he too has a wound in just the same spot. It's just exactly what we find on the shroud, that between the 5th and 6th rib, there's a wound, and this soldier is contemplating his forthcoming death. He knows he's about to die. Well, what you see on the shroud is something that corresponds to the weaponry of the time. So can you see this bloodstain? Look to the top of the bloodstain and you'll see a shape that would correspond to where the lance would enter. About 4 centimeters wide, kind of, you can imagine a double-edged blade because of the tapering of the bloodstain. That would be the spot where the lance entered, and then this is the flow of blood that drips down, if that makes sense. Okay, so that's interesting because the Gospels record just such a thing. Remember, they were going to break his legs, but they find there's no need. Jesus was already dead. And so they pierce his side. Instead, out flows blood and water, John's Gospel records. Now, you can't see blood and water on the shroud if you're looking with the naked eye. But remember, in 1978, these STURP scientists are not looking with the naked eye. They've brought some fancy equipment with them. One of the tests that they do is UV fluorescence. That is, they turn out the lights, they shine a very particular type of light, ultraviolet, right? This is beyond what the human eye can see. This is ultra, beyond violet, right? So they can capture the fluorescence and then read into the chemical composition of what's illuminated with this light. And so what they find in this blood stain is that there's not just red blood, or corpulous blood as it's called, because it is all types of organelles, white blood cells, red blood cells, right? But this is the heavy portion of the blood. But what of the liquid portion? What of the plasma? What of the serum? Well, do you know that we can see it with ultraviolet fluorescence? There's a halo, there's a border around this blood stain. And here, of course, I can only play with Photoshop, right, to kind of simulate this kind of outer glow, if you will, outside of this blood stain. You can't pick it up with the natural eye. You can with ultraviolet fluorescence, but it would seem to be the case that this blood is very special. It's not just blood that was shed during life. This is post-mortem blood. It was shed after death. And that's why the blood is separated. Think about it, this makes sense. If the heart isn't pumping, all of the blood that's accumulated in the heart, which is about the size of a clenched fist, by the way, all of that heavy blood, the corpulous red blood, would settle to the bottom of the heart, right? But the liquid blood, which is less dense, rises to the top. So what happens if you pierce that heart with a lance? What kind of blood will flow out? Separated blood. That is, if you've had time 30, 60 minutes after death for the blood to separate. That seems to be the case here. Now, you got to remember, if this is the work of a con artist, apparently he's very committed to his cause. The victim is even put to death. Okay, so now for a controversial topic, right? Are there signs of resurrection on the shroud? Perhaps there's proof of crucifixion, crowning, scourging, lance in the side, even death. But can we even go so far as to say that with empirical science, there are signs of resurrection? Well, I noticed the question mark in my slide, right? I do think it is a question. I don't think there's a definitive answer here. I would certainly be opposed to those who say there's proof of resurrection, right? I believe that the resurrection is a dogma of faith, right? I believe that it's reasonable to believe in the resurrection, but I don't think there's any empirical science that can prove it. We'll talk more about this relationship of faith and reason later on in the semester. In fact, Father Michael Baggett will be dedicating a whole class to this question of the interplay between faith and reason. But could it be that maybe there's not proof of resurrection, but maybe there's a sign of resurrection? Something that's compatible with resurrection, something that supports the idea of resurrection? Some people think so. I'll leave it for you to discern throughout this semester and throughout the year. But usually, they'll point to two characteristics of the image. Namely, that the body is in rigor mortis. That is, this is that cadaveric rigidity that sets in after death, especially where there's a higher concentration of blood, like in the legs, after there's physical exertion, as someone who was on the cross would have certainly endured. It seems that the body gets really rock hard. This is particularly evident in the buttocks, for example, which are not like fingers pressed against a window pane where the soft tissue is kind of pressed flat, but instead the curvature of the body shows that he's rock solid. And that's important, right? Because I can't go to the cemetery and exhume just any body and expect it to look like this. That is, a body in rigor mortis, right? The body will eventually begin to relax, even decompose or putrefy. But we find no signs of decomposition or putrefaction anywhere on the shroud. You would expect ammonia gas to exit out of the nasal and oral passages, obscuring the facial image. That didn't happen on the shroud. And rigor mortis didn't even begin to relax. And so we got to ask the question to the forensic doctors, when does rigor mortis begin to relax? And they'll typically tell you something like 40 hours. After the 40-hour mark, the body just begins to settle and decompose. But that didn't happen here. And so it's likely that the body, not just likely, it's necessary to assume that the body is taken away, that the body is no longer in contact with the cloth after the 40-hour mark. Okay, so the victim dies, 40 hours later, he's no longer touching that cloth. If the opposite were the case, then we would have a very different image, wouldn't we? You would expect, a decomposing body. That's not at all what we see. Okay, so this rigor mortis, by the way, is easily perceived. Look at the head. See how it's high? Because the victim, even though in the horizontal position, the head seems raised, not because there's a pillow underneath, but because his body was hanging on the cross. Likewise, the knees are raised, not because there's some like triangular support in the tomb, but because his legs were probably bent while on the cross. And now the body maintains that position. Okay? So rigor mortis is the first element which points to resurrection. How does that point to resurrection? Well, let me show you the second thing that we'll point to that is combined to reach this conclusion. Okay? The second thing that oftentimes people will point to is this notion of fibrinolysis. Okay? So fibrinolysis refers to the dissolution or the liquefaction of the fibrin. In other words, the blood that is hard or dried will begin to soften and liquefy by a process called fibrinolysis. Fibrin is the protein that solidifies the blood, that forms a clot, in other words. But then that blood can soften and then liquefy in such a way that the blood can transfer from the body to the cloth that's lying on top of the body. So this blood transfer takes time, right? It doesn't happen in 1 minute or 2 minutes, but the forensic doctors will look to this blood stain and ask, at what point was fibrinolysis interrupted? And what I've read is that somewhere in the range of 30 to 36 hours, fibrinolysis is interrupted. In other words, this victim with that blood stain is no longer in contact with that cloth in the 30 to 36 hour range. Okay, so that's how many hours the cadaver was touching the cloth, apparently, with citing, of course, these forensic doctors that bring this to light. Okay, so do the math. If Jesus was laid in the tomb on Friday night after crucifixion, probably tucked in the tomb before 6 p.m., right, to observe the Sabbath rest. Although that's an open question. Would someone who was in charge of the burial customs also be obliged to honor the Sabbath rest? These are questions that we'll take up later, I hope, in the semester. But it's likely that Jesus is tucked in the tomb around 6 p.m. And so 30 hours later is midnight on Sunday. And 36 hours later is 6 a.m. on Sunday morning. So some would argue that between midnight and 6 a.m., that is precisely when the body is no longer touching the cloth. Well, of course, you would ask Christians, right? Can you guys think of any reason that the body would no longer be touching the cloth? And they say, yeah, he rose from the dead. Maybe that's what accounts for the separation of the cloth. But of course, the scientist who's honest, I think, would also have to say, yeah, we have to come up with a theory which accommodates the data. The data would suggest that there is a separation between the cadaver and the cloth at a point of time right around 30, 36, maybe 40 hours. Okay, but what we don't find, and this is a key point, it's also a debated point, why don't we see signs of smearing, right? If a tomb raider, for example, were coming and wrenching off the cloth, this dried blood, which is now pasted to not only the body, but also to the cloth, right? Kind of this glue that fastens the one to the other. Now you're going to say you're ripping off the cloth, right? Like I've often ripped off a Band-Aid. I know I always have to work up the courage before I do, because I know I'm taking off more than just the Band-Aid, right? A little bit of me is going with it. And so 1, 2, 3, right? Well, what we don't find, even at a microscopic level, anywhere on these bloodstains, signs of displacement, signs of violence, signs of smearing. We find that with the liquid blood that came out of the feet, for example, after the nail is removed, that leaves a very splotchy stain for sure. But at the wrist, that is not the case. We have a highly defined blood stain, and around the edges of it, no signs of smearing. Now some would say, well, perhaps it was just removed very gently and there were no signs. Yeah, perhaps that's exactly right. I don't know. But others have suggested that this is actually a sign of resurrection. How so? Well, Imagine if John were there on Friday night and he remembers how the body was wrapped inside of this linen. And then when he comes back on Sunday morning, what he finds is actually that same linen in the same position, perhaps in the same exact orientation, but no body. And this empty cloth, like a balloon that's lost all its air, right? Perhaps this is a sign to him that this is not the case of tomb raiding. Something very special has happened here. Maybe that's why he saw and believed. I don't know. I can't jump in a time machine and reproduce for you what John saw. But it's an open question, and it's one you should definitely carry with you. So I point this out not to rest my case. On the contrary, I'm opening the question and I'm asking you to bring this to the rest of your studies. And by all means, come to the conclusions that you wish. Now, I want to end this session, but not before contemplating this face, right? Sometimes we get fixated on one element, the blood stain in the wrist, I don't know, the post-mortem blood, and we begin to lose sight of the big picture. What I really think is the most fascinating thing to contemplate is the face of Jesus, if this is indeed the face of the Savior, right? For me, it's always been arresting, the fact that it's such a peaceful face. I can assure you that if I endured something like this, nails in the hands and feet, scourging head to toe, a crown of thorns, I doubt I would be restful like this face. It's as if he's just in a peaceful sleep. And if that's the case, then, if what you're looking at is the moment that Jesus is actually risen from the dead, if it's some sort of radiation, or do you know that there are many scientists who will propose that the most reasonable, or at least the least unreasonable hypothesis is that some sort of energy, some sort of radiation is responsible for this enigmatic image that's on the cloth. Well, then if that's the case, it may well be that in the very moment the image is impressed on the cloth is the very same moment that these eyes open, that this body rises to new life. Could it be that what you're looking at is an image that captures the two central mysteries of Christian faith, namely the incarnation and the resurrection? This is at the core of what makes us Christians, and yet it's also at the heart of this image. You know, sometimes the shroud has been called a miraculous image. And you know, I've never liked that terminology because I'm not sure if the shroud itself is a miracle. And even if it were, I don't know how we could definitively show that to be the case. But might it be that the shroud is no miracle at all, but rather the resurrection is the miracle? In other words, perhaps the shroud is the natural effect of a supernatural event. In other words, the resurrection was something miraculous. But whatever that looks like, I don't know if we could reproduce a resurrection in the laboratory. Something tells me we can't, right? But even that, even if it were the case that we could reproduce a resurrection, might it be that science could actually tell us something about such a phenomenon? In other words, the effect might be measurable, even if the cause might not be. And so I like that explanation myself. I'll be honest. That's my personal opinion, and I share it not because necessarily everyone will agree with me. I know not everyone will, but also just for honesty, this is where I'm coming from. I think that the resurrection took place. I think it's a historical event inside of history, and I think it left a natural effect. But to be honest, that's the least important thing that I've said today. Really, what I'll be looking at in my course will be a biblical consideration of the Passion of the Christ. And that's my area. I'll leave it to others to speak to some of the other questions. But I did want to share that. Before we end, we have just a few minutes before we have to close. Let me share a picture and a song. So the painting is wonderful. It's from Caravaggio. And this is the incredulity of St. Thomas. Really indicative of the realism and the chiaroscuro, the tenebrism of Caravaggio, with these deep shadows and this kind of spectacular, dramatic effect as the doubting Thomas presses his finger into the wounds of Christ. You remember the story in the gospel, right? Doubting Thomas said, even when his friends told him that Jesus was risen from the dead, I will not believe, not unless I press my fingers into the wounds. And so, sure enough, 8 days later, Jesus rises again. And there he tells Thomas, he doesn't chastise him, he doesn't rebuke him. He says, come, put your finger in my side, in the nail wounds in my hands. But do not be unbelieving, but believe. And don't you know that it's doubting Thomas, skeptical Thomas, who has the most direct confession in Christ's divinity of anyone else, anywhere else in the Gospels. It's doubting Thomas who will then say, my Lord and my God. And so might it be that we are called to relive this gospel scene as we look upon the shroud. Of course, we won't be pressing our fingers into the body of Christ, but we might be probing with our microscopes into the shroud. And that is exactly what one photo mock-up will do to this famous painting, replacing the person of Jesus with the linen itself. And now modern-day skeptics are finding themselves in the exact same circumstances, right? Perhaps we began with an initial curiosity about a cloth that was laid in a tomb. But in the end, we ask the bigger questions. Who is this Jesus? Is he alive? And if so, what does that mean for my own life? I think you can see, well, this is a powerful tool for evangelization. And I hope that throughout the rest of the semester, you can continue some of these reflections. Let me leave you with a song that was written by my confrere and friend, Father Stephen Howe from Australia. We entered the seminary together, and one day he attended a tour of the Shroud exhibit, and then he went home and wrote this beautiful song. And it's often how I close my tours, my guides, when pilgrims come to visit our Athoni exhibit here in Rome. And so I'll end there, and when we come back, we'll look at the agony of the Christ, and on we go with a biblical reflection. Okay, please enjoy this song. It's called God's Face by Father Stephen Howe. God bless you.
Who is this man I hardly see, shrouded in silence, speaking to me? Why is his story told in blood and light? What did our God stoop down to write? What will I let him bring to light? I see the nails, I see the blood, my tears fall forth in a cleansing flood. Why did my Savior choose these chains for me? If not that I should be set free. So come, O Lord, and let me see. I do believe that I perceive God's face before me. Open my eyes, I want to see your face before me. I see the crown studded with thorns, I see the royal brow it adorns. Why does my Savior wear this wreath for me? If not that I should reign like he. So come, O Lord, and rule in me. I see his back ravaged and ripped, the wounds where he's been cruelly whipped. Why does my Savior lie torn for me? But that my flesh pure like his should be. So come be chaste, O Lord, in me. I do believe that I perceive God's face before me. Open my eyes, I want to see your face before me. Broken and bruised, cursed and abused, rejected and used, falsely accused. I see his eyes, I see them close. I hear his words spoken in death's throes. Father, forgive them, they don't know what they do. What can I say, Lord, but I love you. I love you, Lord, wanna be like you. I see his eyes opening wide. The king is knocking, wants to come inside. His heart is open, pierced with love for you. What will you say? What will you do? What will you let him work in? All you can gaze, do you now see how dear you are to me? Do you see my love? Does it touch your heart? Shatter all your fears apart. I do believe that I now see God's face before me, God's face before me.